Now, to begin the afternoon session, we have a very special keynote address for you from the chairman of the House of Lords Select Committee on Communications. Please give a very warm welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Lord Inglewood.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very, very much for asking me to speak at the slot. At most conferences is thought to be the absolute death slot, straight after lunch. Now, I think it's true to say that if you look across the European countries, the particularities of what has occurred from country to country are very different. But I think the underlying theme is quite simple. It is that not enough wealth has been created by the money we have collectively spent. And if you look back at the history of economic policy across the Union since then, it seems to me that if you look at both the Lisbon Agenda and now the Europe 2020 Agenda, you see there attempts to kick-start the economy in order to try to move back towards the kind of growth levels that were seen in the European economic community in the 1950s and 60s. Now, it seems to me that the underlying point of the single market, Lord Cofield's project, is just as valid now as it was in 1989. And of course, the reason I put it that way is that, in fact, the single market, in reality, is at best only partially complete. There's been one very important practical technological development, which is the way in which electronic binary code has revolutionized the way the networks that regulate the actual conduct of trade are carried on. The other thing that is terribly important to appreciate is that the world of networks transcend traditional national legal jurisdictions. We cannot see the European single market in isolation. It's got to be part of a wider global whole, which includes China and India and the BRICS and every other country on earth. Now, as you will all know, after its consultations, the Commission, as part of the Europe 2020 programme, has proposed what it's pleased to call 12 levers to boost growth and to strengthen citizens' confidence. And as far as the digital sector is concerned, if you drill down more deeply, you find its document, The Digital Agenda for Europe, which has what it describes as 8 essential areas. Now, don't worry, I'm not proposing to go through them one after the other, very far from it. But I think there is one important point we want to appreciate, and that is it's all interconnected. They're not discrete items. We've got to connect all the component parts of the strategy to make it work. Now, if I turn my thoughts now to thinking about digital in the context, I think there are 3 aspects that we can usefully focus on. The first thing is digital technology is the raw material of the networks that link the consumers and the businesses of Europe together in the single marketplace. Secondly, there is an enormous crossing and interrelationships and mutual arrangements across the single market, all of which take place across networks. And thirdly, just as in the 19th century, those who built the railway lines and promoted them became rich, so the creation and development of these networks is in its own right a generator of wealth, prosperity, and jobs. And of course, as I've touched on and hinted at with my comment about the railways, the networks that link business are changing, and changing fast. And the first problem is, which in a sense is obvious, but it's so obvious sometimes it's overlooked, that these networks cannot link businesses and create wealth if people don't use them. And there's a lot of media illiteracy about. I'm not particularly competent, but if you look across society as a whole, there are still very large numbers of people who, for one reason or another, don't even have the ability to gain elementary access to much of what is there. So it is important that in society there is a program to develop and take forward media literacy. Secondly, it's incredibly important that there is commercial confidence in the networks. And there must be, in the most general of senses, network security. Because if there's no confidence, people won't operate that way. Equally, obviously, we've got to develop payment systems which are reliable and people can have confidence in. And then really it follows from that, we need to find ways in the single market to ensure that when things go wrong, people, particularly those who are in a less strong financial and bargaining position, can actually obtain redress. You need to have confidence that if something goes wrong, there is some realistic way of doing something about it. And then on a more techie level, and I'm not one of those, as I said, there needs to be a set of rules for technical interoperability. I always say it doesn't matter one bit which side of the road cars go on, provided they all go on the same side. And finally, we're in an era of massive technological change, and it is important that the networks that are in place are as up-to-date as possible. And we're now moving into an era of fast and even ultra-fast broadband. And it's important, not least of all, it's important for the slightly further flung bits of the European Union that we get a high standard across the whole. Because if you're dealing with a kind of creaking and groaning system, again, it doesn't encourage the commerce that we all believe, I think, could be generated. And I've recently been involved in writing a report in one of the House of Lords European committees on the proposed changes to consumer contract law across Europe. And the thing that struck me most was that you had an attempt to create a single code, if I could put it that way, of consumer protection rules for the European single market as a whole. And the way in which every member state approached the problem is perhaps hardly surprisingly from the perspective of their own experience. And then it occurred to me, because we in this country feel very, very strongly about giving the consumer a 30-day right to return the goods and get his money back, his or her money back. But if you looked at the other propositions on the table, a lot of countries don't do that at all, despite we thinking it being at the heart of what we consider to be consumer protection. And there's this tendency that I've noticed in European matters for the lowest common denominator to somehow win out, so that you end up by every member state accepting that the particular provision that's close to the heart of another member state is incorporated in the final package. But in the context of consumer protection, it struck me very forcefully that if you did that, the system became completely and totally unworkable. And somehow we've got to have collectively decision makers and policy makers the confidence from time to time to slaughter a domestic sacred cow, because you actually reckon that you can achieve the same result in a slightly different way in interests of getting ultimately to a good that is to the advantage of one and all. And equally, of course, when you're thinking about the digital future, the issues of redress, as I've already mentioned, are terribly important. First of all, if you've got a cross-border transaction, you've got questions about what is the applicable law. And these rules can be quite different in adjoining countries. Secondly, it may well be the case that the language is different in the other country. And thirdly, the sort of general business culture is different. For example, as an example not drawn from Europe, I understand that if you are a very rich Chinese millionaire and you buy a work of art at auction for an enormous price, in the Western world you'd think you'd bought it. But the Chinese tradition is that's like saying having it on approval. And then they'll take it home, put it on their walls, and then they come back and say, yes, we do like it very much indeed, but actually we want to spend quite a lot less money on it than we'd originally suggested. You've got to understand that kind of thing. And we've got to find ways of ensuring that there is proper, reliable, consumer-friendly dispute resolution procedures which are not hugely troublesome, not hugely expensive, and can be user-friendly. Underneath this, there's got to be the rule of law. In primitive societies, or less developed societies, perhaps a better way of putting it, you only do business with your family. When society gets a bit more sophisticated, you extend that to the community you live in, because you know them, you know who you can trust and who you can't. But in a society where you're doing business with people you don't know, you've got to have a rule of law to ensure proper redress when things go wrong. And that law must not be so expensive that it becomes self-defeating. And I suspect one of the crucial aspects of all this is going to be the development of appropriate systems of soft law. I also myself doubt whether in fact cyberspace and the internet can be controlled and regulated within its own jurisdiction. I believe, realistically, the only way it can be done is via the access points and exit points through which people position themselves. And it seems to me that if we have economic failure within the single market, and that includes over-regulation, which I think is not a product of the European Union, but I also suspect is a product of advanced economies, we could find that the whole of the mechanisms we as the countries of Western Europe have, trying to enable us to exert the kind of influence and power that we would like to see on behalf of our countries and our citizens in the 21st century, could be eroded. And if that happens, there must be a real likelihood that we will end up becoming satrapies of the United States, China, India, or Brazil, or what have you. And I don't think that is something I want to see or we want to see. And therefore, it seems to me that the single market, and within it the digital economy, are absolutely crucial to the sustaining and developing the political network of which we are part, and which I believe are going to be so important for us all in the coming century.